Honestly, I still can't believe this happened, but it did. It started one night when I was home alone. My parents had gone out for dinner, leaving me to fend for myself. I was lounging on the couch, scrolling through social media, when I heard a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a tree branch brushing against the window. But then the tapping grew louder, more insistent. I got up to investigate, my heart pounding in my chest. As I walked towards the source of the noise, I realized it was coming from the basement. The basement door was slightly ajar, and the tapping was now accompanied by a low, eerie whispering. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Something inside me screamed not to go down there, but curiosity got the better of me. I slowly opened the door and flicked on the light switch. The old, creaky wooden stairs descended into darkness, the single bulb barely illuminating the space below. Taking a deep breath, I stepped down, one creak at a time. The tapping continued, now sounding like it was coming from the far corner of the basement. As I reached the bottom, the light flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to dance and move on their own. I swallowed hard and moved towards the noise, my footsteps echoing on the cold concrete floor. The tapping grew louder, almost frantic, and the whispering more distinct, though I couldn't make out any words. When I finally reached the corner, I saw an old, dusty chest. The tapping was coming from inside the chest, and my heart nearly stopped. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the rusted latch. The whispering grew louder, as if urging me to open it. With a shaky breath, I lifted the latch and slowly opened the chest. Inside, I found a stack of old photographs, each one more disturbing than the last. They were black and white, depicting a family I didn't recognize. But in each photo, there was something off, distorted faces, shadowy figures lurking in the background, and eyes that seemed to follow me. As I sifted through the photos, the tapping and whispering suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening. I looked around, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. Then, I noticed something else in the chest, a small, ornate box. I picked it up, feeling its cold, metallic surface. As I opened the box, I found a note inside, written in a shaky hand: "Do not disturb the past." Before I could process what it meant, a cold breeze swept through the basement, extinguishing the light. I was plunged into darkness, and I felt an icy hand grip my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The whispering started again, louder and more urgent, and I knew I had to get out of there. I tried to run away, but I felt my body slipping out of consciousness. I couldn't understand what was happening to me. My vision blurred, and my legs felt like they were made of lead. As I stumbled forward, everything around me began to fade into darkness. The last thing I saw was the basement door swinging shut with a resounding thud. When I came to, I was lying on the cold basement floor. My head throbbed, and I felt disoriented. The tapping and whispering were gone, replaced by an eerie silence. I pushed myself up, my hands trembling, and looked around. The chest was still there, but the photographs in the ornate box were gone. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. I tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me and made my way back upstairs. Every step felt like an eternity, and the creaking of the old wooden stairs echoed in my ears. When I finally reached the top, I closed the basement door behind me, hoping to shut out whatever horrors lurked below. But the unease followed me. Strange things started happening around the house. Objects would move on their own, doors would open and close without anyone touching them, and I would hear faint whispers in the middle of the night. I couldn't sleep, my mind constantly replaying the events in the basement. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard a faint rustling sound coming from my closet. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to listen. The rustling grew louder, and then I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible whisper: "You disturbed the past." I froze, my blood running cold. The whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, and the temperature seemed to drop. Summoning all my courage, I got out of bed and slowly approached the closet. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, but before I could touch it, the door burst open on its own. Inside, I saw a figure shrouded in darkness. Its eyes glowed an unnatural shade of red, and it reached out towards me with long, skeletal fingers. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body was frozen in place. The figure stepped forward, its whispers now a deafening roar. "You should have left it alone," it hissed, its voice echoing in my head. "Now you will pay the price." I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if something was squeezing my heart. My vision blurred, and I fell to the floor, gasping for breath. The last thing I saw was the figure standing over me, its eyes burning into mine. Then everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, surrounded by beeping machines and sterile white walls. My parents were there, their faces etched with worry. They told me they had found me unconscious on my bedroom floor, barely breathing. The doctors couldn't explain what had happened to me, and I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. The events of that night still haunt me. I moved out of that house as soon as I could, but the memories follow me wherever I go. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear the faint whispering, reminding me of the past I disturbed and the price I had to pay.
I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural until I moved into Cedarwood House. It was an old Victorian-style mansion nestled in the outskirts of town, rumored to be haunted. But I was a skeptic, someone who always sought logical explanations for everything. That changed when I started experiencing things I couldn't rationalize. It all began shortly after I moved in. The first few nights were peaceful, and I enjoyed the tranquility of my new home. But on the fourth night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, almost like someone was knocking on a door. Groggy and half asleep, I dismissed it as a tree branch brushing against the window and went back to sleep. The next night, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent. This time, I got up to investigate. I walked through the dimly lit hallways, following the sound. It led me to the attic. The door to the attic was slightly ajar, and the tapping seemed to be coming from inside. My heart pounded in my chest as I hesitated at the threshold, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open and climbed the narrow, creaky stairs. The attic was filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and forgotten memories. The tapping grew louder, and I realized it was coming from a large, antique trunk in the corner. I approached it cautiously, my hand trembling as I lifted the lid. Inside the trunk, I found a stack of old letters tied together with a faded ribbon. They were addressed to a woman named Margaret, and the handwriting was elegant but shaky. As I read the first letter, I felt a chill run down my spine. It spoke of love, loss, and a haunting presence that wouldn't let go. The letters were filled with accounts of strange occurrences, whispers in the night, cold drafts, and shadowy figures. The more I read, the more I felt a connection to Margaret. She had lived in Cedarwood House long ago and had experienced the same eerie phenomena. Her final letter was a desperate plea for help, saying that the presence had become more aggressive and that she feared for her life. As I finished reading the last letter, the attic door slammed shut and the temperature dropped suddenly. My breath formed misty clouds in the air, and I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. The tapping started again, this time louder and more frantic. I bolted out of the attic and rushed downstairs, my heart racing. That night, I barely slept, my mind replaying the events in the attic. The next morning, I decided to do some research on Cedarwood House and its former occupants. What I discovered sent shivers down my spine. I bolted out of the attic and rushed downstairs, my heart racing. That night, I barely slept, my mind replaying the events in the attic. The next morning, I decided to do some research on Cedarwood House and its former occupants. What I discovered sent shivers down my spine. Margaret had lived in the house over a century ago. She was a young widow who had moved there to escape her past, but the house had a dark history. It was said that the original owner, a man named Edward, had been obsessed with the occult and had conducted dark rituals in the house. He disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and the house had been abandoned for years before Margaret moved in. As I delved deeper into the history, I found newspaper articles about Margaret's disappearance. She had vanished without a trace, and her case remained unsolved. The locals believed that the house was cursed and that anyone who lived there would meet a tragic fate. I tried to convince myself that it was all just stories and superstitions, but the strange occurrences continued. The tapping, the whispers, and the cold drafts became a nightly torment. I felt like I was being watched, and I started seeing shadowy figures out of the corner of my eye. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom door slowly creaking open. A figure stood in the doorway, its eyes glowing a sinister red. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream. The figure stepped closer, and I could see its features: pale skin, hollow eyes, and a twisted grin. It reached out towards me, and I felt an icy grip around my neck. I struggled to breathe, my vision blurring. Just when I thought I would pass out, the figure vanished, and I was left gasping for air. I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer. It was trying to take me, just like it had taken Margaret. The next day, I packed my belongings and prepared to leave. As I was loading the last box into my car, I felt a cold breeze and heard a faint whisper, "You can't escape." I turned to see the shadowy figure standing in the doorway, watching me with those eerie red eyes. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I jumped into my car and sped away, not looking back. I drove for hours until I reached a friend's house, where I finally felt safe. But even now, I can still feel the presence of Cedarwood House haunting me. I sold the house and moved to a different city, but the memories linger. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the tapping sound and feel a cold draft. I know that the house still remembers me, and that it will always be a part of my past. The experience changed me. I'm no longer the skeptic I once was. I know now that there are things in this world that defy logic and reason. Cedarwood House taught me that some places are truly haunted, and some spirits never rest. I never should have taken that summer job at the old Stillwater Lodge. Nestled deep in the woods by a secluded lake, it seemed like the perfect escape from the chaos of city life. The lodge was ancient, built in the early 1900s, and had seen better days. The paint was peeling, the windows were cracked, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. But it paid well, and I needed the money for college. My first few days were uneventful. I spent most of my time cleaning the dusty rooms and tending to the overgrown garden. The guests were few and far between, mostly older couples looking for a quiet retreat. The lake itself was beautiful, with crystal clear water that sparkled in the sunlight. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, an eerie stillness would settle over the place, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One evening, while I was sitting on the dock, I heard a faint, melodic humming drifting across the water. I looked around, but saw no one. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, and it seemed to be coming from the center of the lake. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take one of the rowboats out to investigate. As I paddled towards the center of the lake, the humming grew louder, more hypnotic. The water was unnaturally calm, reflecting the moonlight like a mirror. I reached the middle of the lake and stopped rowing, letting the boat drift. The humming was all around me now, enveloping me in its ethereal melody. I leaned over the edge of the boat, peering into the depths. The water was so clear that I could see the bottom, but there was something strange about it. The lakebed was dotted with what looked like old decayed structures, remnants of buildings and streets, as if an entire town lay submerged beneath the water. My heart pounded as I realized that the ruins below matched the descriptions of the lost town of Stillwater, which had been flooded a century ago to create the lake. Suddenly, the boat lurched violently, and I was thrown into the water. Panic set in as I struggled to stay afloat. The humming grew louder, now a chorus of voices calling my name. I felt something cold and slimy wrap around my ankle, pulling me down. I fought against it, but it was too strong. My head went under, and everything went dark. When I came to, I was lying on the dock, soaked and shivering. My head throbbed, and I had a vague memory of being pulled to the surface by an unseen force. The lodge manager, an old man named Mr. Harris, stood over me, his face pale and grim. "You shouldn't have gone out there," he said, his voice trembling. "Stillwater Lake has a dark history. The town that lies beneath it was cursed before it was flooded. The spirits of those who perished are trapped in the water, and they lure the living to join them." I wanted to believe he was just trying to scare me, but the fear in his eyes was real. I spent the next few days avoiding the lake, trying to shake off the lingering dread. But the humming continued, haunting my dreams and filling my waking hours with unease. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to confront whatever was haunting the lake. I took a flashlight and a pair of binoculars and headed to the dock. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. As I scanned the surface with the binoculars, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood in the middle of the lake, its outline barely visible in the moonlight. It was a woman, her long hair floating around her like a dark halo. She raised her hand and beckoned to me, her eyes glowing an unnatural green. I dropped the binoculars and stumbled back, but the image was burned into my mind. The next day, I decided to leave Stillwater Lodge. I packed my things and headed for the bus stop, but as I walked through the woods, I felt an overwhelming urge to return to the lake. It was as if something was calling to me, pulling me back. I fought against it, but my legs moved of their own accord, leading me back to the dock. The humming was louder than ever, and the water seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly light. I stood at the edge of the dock, staring into the depths. The figure of the woman appeared again, her eyes locking onto mine. She raised her hand, and I felt a cold, irresistible pull. I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, my parents sitting anxiously by my side. They told me that I had been found unconscious by the lake, barely alive. The doctors couldn't explain how I had survived, given how long I had been in the water. I never went back to Stillwater Lodge. The place was eventually shut down, and the lake was deemed off-limits, but the memory of that summer haunts me. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the faint, melodic humming and feel the cold pull of the lake. I know now that some places are best left undisturbed, and some spirits never rest. I never imagined that my life would take such a strange and terrifying turn when I inherited Blackwood Manor. As a young woman in my early 20s, fresh out of college and eager to start my career in journalism, the last thing I expected was to inherit an old mansion from a distant relative I barely knew existed. The letter arrived out of the blue, informing me that my great-uncle Henry, whom I had never met, had passed away and left his estate to me. Curiosity and a sense of adventure led me to accept the inheritance and journey to the small, secluded town of Blackwood. Blackwood Manor was situated on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. The mansion itself was a grand but dilapidated structure, with ivy crawling up the stone walls and windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in decades. Despite its eerie appearance, there was something captivating about the place. It felt like stepping into a different era, a forgotten piece of history waiting to be uncovered. The first few days were spent cleaning and exploring the mansion. I discovered rooms filled with antique furniture, dusty books, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors. One room in particular caught my attention, a small locked study at the end of a narrow hallway. The door was made of heavy oak and adorned with intricate carvings. It seemed out of place, more elaborate than the other doors in the house. My curiosity was piqued, but I couldn't find the key. Life in the manor was peaceful at first. The townspeople were friendly enough, though they seemed wary of the mansion and often warned me about the strange happenings associated with it. They spoke in hushed tones about the Phantom of Blackwood Manor, a ghostly figure that supposedly haunted the estate. I dismissed their stories as local folklore, the kind of tales that small towns often cling to. But then, the strange occurrences began. It started with small things, doors creaking open on their own, cold drafts in the middle of the night, and the feeling of being watched. At first, I tried to rationalize these events. The manor was old after all, and old houses have their quirks. But as the days went by, the incidents became harder to ignore. One night, as I was reading in the library, I heard a faint whispering sound. It was so soft that I thought I had imagined it, but it grew louder, forming words that I couldn't quite make out. I followed the sound through the darkened hallways, my heart pounding in my chest. It led me to the locked study. The whispering stopped abruptly as I reached the door, and a chill ran down my spine. Determined to find answers, I searched the mansion for the key to the study. After days of searching, I finally found it hidden in an old, ornate jewelry box in the attic. My hands trembled as I inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a room that seemed untouched by time. A large mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, and shelves lined with dusty books covered the walls. But it was the portrait above the fireplace that caught my attention. It was a painting of a man who bore a striking resemblance to me. He had the same dark hair and piercing blue eyes. The plaque beneath the portrait read, "Henry Blackwood, my great-uncle." As I stared at the portrait, I felt a strange connection, as if the man in the painting was watching me. On the desk, I found a leather-bound journal. It was Henry's journal, and it detailed his research into the supernatural. He had been obsessed with the occult and had conducted numerous experiments in the study, trying to contact spirits and unlock the secrets of the afterlife. The final entries were frantic, describing how he believed he had succeeded in summoning a powerful entity that had now bound itself to the manor. As I read the last entry, the room grew colder, and the whispering began again. This time, I could understand the words. "Free me." I looked around, but there was no one there. The whispering seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My pulse quickened as I realized that the stories of the phantom might not be just folklore after all. Over the next few days, the hauntings intensified. I would wake up in the middle of the night to find my bedroom door open, shadows flitting across the walls, and the feeling of icy fingers brushing against my skin. Objects would move on their own, and I would hear footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. The whispers became more insistent, always repeating the same plea, "Free me." Desperate for answers, I reached out to a local historian who had written extensively about Blackwood Manor. His name was Thomas Green, and he was more than willing to share his knowledge. According to Thomas, Henry Blackwood had indeed been deeply involved in the occult. He had built the study as a sanctuary for his experiments and had gone to great lengths to protect it from prying eyes. Thomas also revealed that Henry had a twin sister named Eleanor who had died under mysterious circumstances. Her death had left Henry devastated, and he had become increasingly obsessed with finding a way to contact her spirit. The townspeople believed that Henry's experiments had gone horribly wrong and that he had inadvertently summoned a malevolent entity that now haunted the manor. Armed with this new information, I decided to conduct my own investigation. I spent hours in the study, poring over Henry's journal and the books on the shelves. I discovered that Henry had been attempting to perform a ritual to bind the spirit of his sister to the manor, believing that he could bring her back to life. But something had gone terribly wrong, and instead of Eleanor's spirit, he had summoned a dark, malevolent force that had taken control of the house. One night, as I was deep in research, I found a hidden compartment in the desk. Inside was an ancient book bound in black leather. The pages were filled with cryptic symbols and incantations. It was a grimoire, a book of dark magic. Among the spells and rituals, I found one that seemed to match Henry's description of the ritual he had attempted. It was a binding spell, meant to trap a spirit within a physical object. I realized that if I could find the object to which the spirit was bound, I might be able to break the spell and free the entity haunting the manor. I scoured the mansion, searching for any clues that might lead me to the object. Days turned into weeks, and I grew increasingly frustrated and frightened. The hauntings continued unabated, and I felt the entity's presence growing stronger. One stormy night, as I was searching the basement, I discovered a hidden room behind a false wall. The room was small and bare, except for a single, ornate box resting on a pedestal in the center. The box was intricately carved with symbols matching those in the grimoire. I knew instantly that this was the object I had been searching for. As I reached out to touch the box, a powerful force knocked me back, and the room filled with a deafening roar. The whispering voices screamed in unison, "Free me!" I gathered my courage and opened the grimoire, chanting the incantation to break the binding spell. The room shook, and the air grew thick with a malevolent presence. With each word I spoke, the box began to tremble, and a blinding light filled the room. The roar grew louder, and I felt a searing pain in my chest, as if my very soul was being torn apart. But I pressed on, determined to see the ritual through to the end. As I spoke the final words, the light intensified, and the box shattered into 1,000 pieces. The roaring stopped, and a deafening silence fell over the room. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted and in pain. When I opened my eyes, the room was empty, and the oppressive presence that had haunted the manor was gone. I slowly made my way back upstairs, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. The mansion was still and quiet, the air no longer heavy with dread. I knew that the entity had been freed, and the curse of Blackwood Manor was finally lifted. In the weeks that followed, I worked to restore the manor to its former glory. The townspeople, once wary of the place, began to visit and share their stories of its past. I wrote an article about my experiences, detailing the history of the manor and the haunting that had plagued it for so long. The story gained national attention, and Blackwood Manor became a place of fascination for ghost hunters and paranormal enthusiasts. But despite the newfound attention, I never forgot the terror I had experienced. The whispers, the cold drafts, the feeling of being watched, they were etched into my memory. I knew that while the entity had been freed, the spirits of those who had perished in the town of Stillwater still lingered, bound to the place by the dark history that could never be fully erased. Blackwood Manor had become my home, and I was determined to honor its history and the memory of those who had lived and died there. As I stood on the front porch, looking out over the tranquil grounds, I felt a sense of peace. The shadows of the past had been laid to rest, and a new chapter was beginning. But sometimes, in the quiet moments just before dawn, I would hear a faint, melodic humming drifting across the lake. It was a reminder of the mysteries that still lay beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. And I knew that the story of Blackwood Manor was far from over. The invitation to stay at Hollow's Inn arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I had been working tirelessly as an investigative journalist in the city, chasing down leads and exposing corruption, when the letter appeared on my desk. It was written in an elegant, old-fashioned script, inviting me to spend a week at the historic estate of a distant relative, Lydia Holloway, whom I had never met. The timing was perfect. I needed a break from the city's chaos, and the idea of retreating to the countryside was appealing. Hollow's Inn was a sprawling estate nestled deep in the woods of rural Maine. The journey there was long and arduous, the narrow roads winding through dense forests that seemed to close in around me. As I approached the estate, I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The mansion loomed ahead, its dark silhouette framed against the overcast sky. Lydia Holloway greeted me at the door, a frail but graceful woman in her 70s. Her eyes sparkled with an otherworldly gleam, and she spoke with a soft, melodic voice that seemed to echo through the cavernous halls of the mansion. "Welcome, dear," she said, her smile warm but tinged with sadness. "I trust your journey was pleasant." "It was long, but I'm glad to be here," I replied, forcing a smile. "The estate is beautiful." "It has been in our family for generations," Lydia said, leading me inside. "But it holds many secrets, as I'm sure you'll discover." The interior of Hollow's Inn was a labyrinth of narrow hallways, grand rooms filled with antique furniture, and dimly lit corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. Lydia showed me to my room, a cozy space with a large canopy bed and a window overlooking the dense woods. As I unpacked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The first night was uneventful. I dined with Lydia in the grand dining hall, where portraits of long-dead ancestors stared down at us with hollow eyes. Lydia spoke of the history of Hollow's Inn, recounting tales of the Holloway family's triumphs and tragedies. As the night wore on, I felt an inexplicable heaviness in the air, as if the very walls were whispering secrets. I retired to my room early, hoping to get a good night's sleep. But as I lay in bed, I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from the walls. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the house settling. But the tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to echo through the entire room. Unable to sleep, I got up and decided to explore the mansion. The hallways were dark and silent, the only light coming from the occasional flickering candle. As I wandered, I found myself drawn to a locked door at the end of one particularly narrow corridor. The door was old and weathered, with an intricate carving of a tree on its surface. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Curiosity gnawed at me, and I resolved to find a way inside. The next morning, I asked Lydia about the door, but she grew visibly uncomfortable and changed the subject. Determined to uncover the secrets of Hollow's End, I began to search the mansion for a key. Days passed, and the strange occurrences continued. I would hear whispers in the dead of night, feel cold drafts where there shouldn't be any, and catch glimpses of shadowy figures out of the corner of my eye. Lydia's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would often disappear for hours at a time, only to reappear looking more haggard and worn. One evening, as I was exploring the attic, I stumbled upon an old chest covered in dust. Inside, I found a collection of letters and photographs, as well as a small, ornate key. My heart raced as I realized that this might be the key to the locked door. I waited until Lydia had retired for the night before making my way to the corridor. The key fit perfectly, and the door creaked open, revealing a hidden room bathed in an eerie blue light. The walls were lined with shelves filled with ancient books and strange artifacts. In the center of the room stood a large stone altar, its surface covered in runes and symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. As I approached the altar, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The air grew thick, and the temperature dropped sharply. I reached out to touch the altar, and the room was filled with a blinding flash of light. When my vision cleared, I found myself standing in a dense forest, the mansion nowhere in sight. Panic set in as I realized I was completely alone. The forest was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. I wandered aimlessly, trying to find my way back, but the landscape seemed to shift and change around me. Hours passed, and I grew more disoriented and frightened. As night fell, the forest came alive with strange, otherworldly sounds. Whispers echoed through the trees, and I could feel eyes watching me from the shadows. I stumbled upon a clearing where a large, gnarled tree stood at its center. The tree was ancient, its branches twisted and reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. At the base of the tree, I found a small, weathered journal. The pages were filled with frantic, disjointed entries written in a language I couldn't understand. As I flipped through the journal, I realized that it belonged to Lydia. She had been documenting her attempts to contact the spirits of the forest, seeking knowledge and power from the ancient entities that dwelled within. A sudden rustling in the bushes made me freeze. I turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows. It was Lydia, but she looked different. Her eyes were hollow, and her skin was pale and translucent. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "The forest is alive, and it demands a sacrifice." I backed away, but Lydia advanced toward me, her movements jerky and unnatural. "You must take my place," she continued. "The spirits are restless, and they will not let us leave." Desperate, I turned and ran, the forest closing in around me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I felt a cold, clammy hand brush against my shoulder. I stumbled and fell, my vision blurring as the ground seemed to shift beneath me. When I awoke, I was back in the hidden room, the blue light flickering and fading. Lydia was nowhere to be seen, and the mansion was eerily silent. I fled the room and ran to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what had happened. The journal, the forest, Lydia's transformation, it all seemed like a nightmare. The next morning, I decided to leave Hollow's End. I packed my things and made my way to the front door, but as I reached for the handle, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned to see Lydia standing there, her eyes empty and soulless. "You can't leave," she whispered. "The spirits won't allow it." I pushed past her and ran out of the house, not stopping until I reached my car. As I drove away, I glanced back at the mansion, its dark silhouette receding into the distance. I knew that I could never return, that Hollow's End would forever be a place of darkness and mystery. In the weeks that followed, I tried to put the experience behind me, but the memories haunted me. I could still hear the whispers, feel the cold touch of the spirits, and see Lydia's hollow eyes. I wrote about my ordeal, hoping that sharing my story would bring some measure of closure. But even now, as I sit in my apartment, far from the mansion, I can't escape the feeling that the spirits of Hollow's End are still with me. The whispers follow me in the dead of night, and I see shadowy figures in my peripheral vision. I know that the forest is still out there, waiting, and that the spirits are always watching. And sometimes, in the quiet moments just before sleep takes me, I can hear Lydia's voice echoing through the darkness, reminding me that some secrets are best left undiscovered.